Cold take. Super cold take. Super cold take. Like frozen in the freezer cold take. I believe Party in the USA by Miley Cyrus should be the national anthem. Now, I realize when I say this cold take, it might stir up a lot of controversy and like political issues, but I say it with all my pride and all my heart.
What makes this a cold take?
It's because it's just a fact. It should be the national anthem.
I think it's a hotter take than me saying cats are overrated.
I agree with that.
I think it's cold, and let's talk about it. I also have no reasons to support this take. It's just a take.
The one reason I would support this, I mean, minus that Party in the USA is a straight bop, is that the melody is easier to sing. And that is the one critique that I have of the U.S. national anthem. This melody is impossible to sing. And for like a group song, why would you do that?
I put my hands up. They're playing my song. What is it? But there's a song referenced in the song.
Now, maybe that could be the
That's
national
okay.
anthem.
Would the song she's hearing be the Star Spangled Banner?
It might be.
What happened if you just like overlaid them? Like it's Party of the USA.
I wonder if someone's
over the
already
Star
done
Spangled
that.
Banner.
I'm positive someone has done that.
But Chris, you seem very uncomfortable about this.
I don't like Miley Cyrus. That's my biggest. That's my biggest concern. I mean, I also don't have a problem with that. So
I didn't say that.
but you
I
have
am
in the
blinded.
past. Party in the U.S. I mean, it is catchy. I don't know the words.
I too do not know all the words. I just know put my hands up, play my song. Oh no,
Yeah.
Yes, the virus is in my head.
it's a party in the USA.
So we've just succumbed to partying.
I think that's a
Isn't that the
fair
American
assumption
lifestyle?
yeah.
I think it,
It's like oppression and partying. Like those are the two things.
She just
that you
needs
do
to.
in
I
the
don't think she
United
talks
States.
about guns in the party in the USA. So
Oh
then,
right, guns.
yeah.
We need that too. America.
yeah, I disagree.
Hey guys, so today I want to talk about the topic of evangelism. The title of this episode, I called it, Have You Heard of Our Lord Savior Jesus Christ? And I realize that's a really long title episode. But in all actuality, I think I've been struggling a little bit with the idea of what evangelism is. And I think over the course of college and my young adulthood, I've always wondered, like, what is the place and what exactly... how do people approach it, right? I think there's your stereotypical version of where people are out on the street saying, oh, have you heard about Jesus? Can I tell you about Jesus? And that's never sat well with me. I've never really liked the idea of just like going out and about and just saying, oh, like, let me tell you about Jesus and why you need to be saved, right? And in the Bible, there's the great commandment, which is in Matthew 28, verse 19 through 20. Therefore, and go make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of this age. So as I'm exiting working in ministry, I remember I had this conversation with another individual about the idea of what evangelizing is. And for me, I thought the way I've always looked at it has been kind of the sense of just love first, right? I think you guys are both well aware of how I approach my relationships and how I interact with people. But I've never been a fan of saying, oh, I'm a Christian, so therefore that's why I do all the things I do. And maybe that in itself is blasphemous. Maybe that in itself has a lot of issues. And maybe some might even say, Sam, you're just a lukewarm Christian, right? But for me, at the source of it, like, and again, I feel free to correct me. Feel free to kind of give me a broader understanding. Of course, this is a conversation. And I think for me, like, the idea of, like, my version of evangelism, for just a lack of better words, is just to love people, to show my faith, to show why I believe in Jesus through my actions and interactions with other people. I think people do notice. I do think people will have, it does open opportunities, but I want to focus on developing a relationship, which then hopefully can lead to more conversations about Christ, as opposed to the flip side, which is, let me tell you about Christ and let me bring you into this and then develop a relationship built on that one factor. I think there is a time and place for it. I have witnessed it working for other people, but for me, that just doesn't sit well and the way I interact. So I think this first point, I just want to hear like kind of what your initial takes are on evangelism and kind of like what you understand biblically or also like in life. So have at it. I'm just very curious to hear what you guys have so I can broaden my understanding.
It's like the idea of like actions speak louder than words. I think is kind of the idea you're getting at as well. And I mean that's what I agree with as well. Is like I don't want to say it's easy to say things because it's not, but for sake of argument, it's easy to say things. It's hard to show those actions in your life in an external manner to have people see that and say, "Oh, why is he like that?" Right? I mean, we did an episode eons ago about like being in the world versus of the world, right? And how like sure we are in the world, we're an entity, we are acting in the way, interacting with the rest of the world, but we're supposed to be set apart and separate from the world. And like being that in that way, being away and separate and different from the rest of the world is a way of showing God's love and evangelizing in a way. And so, I mean, to me, that's kind of the largest thing I think of, and I think all three of us agree in that sense, is like, that's kind of what being, evangelism is, like acting, showing Christ's love to the rest of the world, right? Is through actions opposed to through words and, holding up a sign, right? I guess one thing that I want to touch on quickly is the idea of like evangelism versus like the like evangelical. And like for me, those words often like I know they're two very separate things, and I will touch on those in a second. They do get a little messed up because they are very similar and they have very similar etymology. Is that the right word? And so it's like they get kind of switched up in my brain, and like also. So we'll talk about evangelical first, and then we'll talk about evangelism. So evangelical, I have a definition of it real quick. All right, so evangelical, the adjective is of according to the teaching of the gospel or the Christian religion. Sorry, the font was really small. I couldn't read it. So if something is evangelical, it aligns with the teaching of the gospel. I don't think that word is often used in the United States. The more common use of the word evangelical is of the evangelical denomination or the tradition of evangelical, which is the noun version of the word. Evangelical, a member of the evangelical tradition in the Christian church, right? So that's kind of the way that we think of it often is a member of the evangelical church, which is an interesting denomination, which I didn't know much about and very quickly read on. And yeah, it is interesting. In the past, it's also been used to describe Protestants as a whole and some other things. So the word is kind of all over the place. And I think the word is difficult because nowadays evangelical has become very politicized. And so it's like hard to take away from like saying something is like an evangelical teaching, like of the Bible, of truth, of Christian religion, opposed to like a teaching of an evangelical pastor. And so it's like it just becomes very messy very quickly. And there's a lot of people, I mean, regardless of, political beliefs and where you stand in, the chaos that is the U.S. political system, there's a lot of things that evangelical churches, and I'm sure somebody could say that about any church that I've attended or any that are not evangelical teachings, right? Like teachings of the Bible. So it is hard to like separate those two words. And then it's so close to this word of evangelism that it's like it often gets like wrapped into this like whole political mess and like very ugly things and things that are not very of the Bible. And so it's like, it's difficult. And for me, that distinction is very like at the front of my brain when I think of the word evangelical, as you can see, evangelism.
Right.
It's very like up, like right there. And so it is difficult for me to be like, oh, I totally stand like, I'm like, I want to be out on the streets evangelizing, right? Like I wouldn't use that verb because it has all these other things messed into it. And so I guess let me touch on evangelism real quick, what that word means, and then one of you guys can take it. So evangelism, the definition, is the spreading of the Christian gospel by public preaching or personal witness. a zealous advocation of cause. Cool. So basically the act of sharing the Bible, and I think the word by public preaching or personal witness is very interesting and touches on it very nicely. It kind of gives these two ways of evangelizing, by public preaching and by personal witness. And that is like kind of what you were touching on at the beginning too, is like it's really, back to the point I was making, it's really easy to publicly preach, but it's hard to be a personal witness. And that's not necessarily, I don't completely stand behind, it is very difficult to preach, and it's very hard to share the gospel out loud. But yeah, there's kind of those two ways, even the definition says that, of evangelizing. It's so confusing.
I appreciate
There's
your effort
so many
going into that.
words.
E is for evangelism.
E is for evangelizing. And so like that's probably my biggest struggle with the word itself, right? Like, I mean, I there's a lot of people who I think do a terrible job of evangelizing on the street, and there's some pastors in churches which I do some terrible things and are evangelizing. And so it's like, there's also some who do a great job, and there's some who are really doing great things. And so it is really difficult when those words just get so mashed. And so, I mean, I just really want to make that distinction for my own self, but I think it will help kind of clarify. And maybe actually made it worse because there's a lot of connections between those two. But yeah, for me personally, that is what the idea of evangelism brings.
I really do appreciate you looking and also differentiating kind of those two words, because I think in my head, it's the similar thing. It's just like, I'm like struggling. I'm just like, oh my gosh, like when have I used, in what context do I see those words and in what ways have I used those words, and like the key differences, right? Because I forget about that. Well, I don't forget about the political connections. I think that's also a big thing that makes me uncomfortable. So, no, I appreciate that.
In theory, you could have evangelical evangelism, but let's just not pretend that that's real.
Yeah.
That might hurt my brain.
I'm hurting right now.
Yeah. No, I think the points you're making are really good, because I was just reading this book, and it was really annoying the way it was written, and I didn't finish it. But he was making a good point about, there was like a guy who was preaching to his coworker about how he's like, I gave him the Jesus talk and told him like, you're a sinner and you need to be saved and all this. And the guy just shut down, obviously, and didn't want to talk to him anymore because he's the weird Christian at work. And it's like, well, that person you're talking to probably isn't convinced that they're a sinner, or that if they are, that they need saving or anything. Like, there's a lot of baggage with this kind of stuff. So, I think there was like a period of time, and there are probably still like pockets in the world where like it's effective to like share the gospel publicly. Like Billy Graham was America's pastor, things like that. And like people were apt to receive that because of whatever reason, I don't know, combination of him being really good and like the way that information was taken in. And I think a lot of people still think that's the best way to do it because it worked at one point in time, like handing out little tracts. And,
Right. The golden age of,
things like that. And I mean, like, I'm a huge fan of Chuck Colson, who was a very controversial figure because he worked with Nixon and was incarcerated, all that, Watergate, and he was from that era, like the 60s and things like that. And I think a lot of the people that are still reliant or reminiscent of that are like, they have a hard time adapting to like postmodernism, because we're moving out of modernism into postmodernism, which is really confusing, but also one of my favorite like subject matters.
I want to ask. Yeah, I'm so curious. Yeah, sorry. I have a lot of more questions are like coming, but I want continue. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's just like, I think the way that we take in information combined with like the drastic technological changes that have happened. Like, I had a customer at work who used to make his own electricity, and now he like has an iPhone, and it's like, so some people can make that change, but I think a lot of people like have a hard time adapting to like.
Do you serve Benjamin Franklin?
Like what?
Benny, how was the kite?
Yeah, he loves his eggs over easy. Yeah. So I think like.
Sorry.
No,
that was good.
That was really funny.
You and I both looked at each other, and I was just like, I heard that, right?
Right. No, that's weird though. Like, I was like, you made your own electricity? Like, we're not that like, I don't know. Like, that was a while ago. But like, I think a lot of people now, it's like no matter how well spoken you are, or like how strategically placed you are in like the subway or like an area of town or things like that, like no matter how well prepared you are, a lot of people are not going to receive that well because like that's not how we take in information a lot of the time anymore, and there's a lot of noise in the airwaves. And like there does come a point where like you have to be unashamed of sharing your faith. I think,
Right.
like you said, like there is a point where like you want to give the unabridged version and not be not like mince words, but like I don't know that's the best circumstance to do it. I'm more like relationships like you are, like finding a way that's tactful, you know, to bring it up. So
Yeah. Okay.
yeah.
So I guess like using that as a segue, right? I think that was the next thing I want to talk about. And before we say that, I need to do a quick camera check. So Tyler, cut this. Sam, cut this. And we're back. Thank you for your patience, Sam and Tyler in the future. So segueing from what Chris was just talking about, like kind of like from a modernism to postmodernism, I raised the question that with times changing, should we be rethinking what evangelism is? Running back and forth, I'm out of breath. And I think, I guess you guys have already kind of got the gist of it. I do think that we need to rethink it. It just doesn't sit well with me. And we were talking about like that weird Christian coworker, right, who like talks about their faith, and I think they do it in good nature. But again, that approach is, I just like think at the base of being a human being, like it doesn't work. You don't show love, you don't show respect, and even though you think at the core of it that's what's driving you, the reality is that people are perceiving you as pushing an agenda, as you trying to like change their mind or shame them for what they do, right? And I think with that too, I think it's also the idea of like, what is conviction, right? With gospel sharing. I think a lot about my summer camp, especially since, and you work with the youth group, and Tyler, you were a youth and you work with youth, but
We were all youth.
we are all
You
youths.
more recently.
I am younger, yes.
But like the idea of like, how do we present the gospel in a way that I guess like speaks to people, right? Priorities have shifted, and I think it's a conversation I've had every single year, and I feel like with all the different organizations I'm a part of, there's no coherent like move. Like they're like, oh, this is the way, right? We are shifting away from the idea of like, oh, like handing out pamphlets and like going out into the streets. Well, some of us are. I think there are some organizations who are like, oh, we should have a Sunday dedicated to this where we just go out, and I'm just like, I don't know how I feel making this like a holiday once a year and everything, but that's just my critique. So all in all, I do think we need to rethink it. And then the next thing is, how are we going to approach it? I don't know. I really do think relationships is the bigger aspect, right? Like, how do we support people, especially with all these different movements for like the fighting like for social justice, right? I think that's a fantastic avenue. It's just like, what would Jesus do? How would he love people? And even that in itself is a topic of controversy. But yeah, all in all, I have thoughts. I have no direction, but I want to glean from you guys.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing, I'm sorry to jump in, Chris, but I
No,
like
you
to.
should.
My first thought was like, well, what did they do in the ancient church days? And like, that's true, and we'll think about that in a second. But my one word of warning for myself and us as well is that it's really easy to romanticize the early church in the sense of like, wow, they really had the gospel figured out and they really know how to do that. But then you like look and like there's like 10 letters in the Bible that say they kind of have messed it up a little bit.
Right.
10 is not the right number. And so like with that in mind, they made a lot of mistakes. But something I do think that they did really well is they lived life together. And that phrase is very empty, and I want to say something better. Like, they actually cared and were like, hey, how can I help you? How can I do that? And I mean, not to be like doomsday, today's culture, but like, that's something we don't do, right?
Right.
But we do to some extent, right? Like, I mean, people are always like caring and living life once you're in that Christian community. Like, I think about like all the people who really care for my life and care for like, would be there if I needed help or anything like that, are like, in a Christian community who I would feel
it's a
safe
bubble.
to.
Yeah.
Right. And like that norm is already established, and that's great. And I don't think that's a bad thing at all. But it's like extending that norm. And there's a lot of Christians who do great work and actually do that extremely well. But I think that is a great way to care for people, right? Because that's important and super crucial, and to love your neighbor and the people around you, but also to share the gospel in that sense is like you have this amazing ability to care for people, to help people in need, and to through that action, and as I said before, personal witness, right? Is you have this ability to share through that moment, and like I said, as soon as I said the words like help people, I like regretted saying it because I was like, so many Christians go like, we're feeding the hungry, we're clothing the people that don't have clothes, we're sheltering the homeless, and it's like, I don't mean to knock that. That's great. That's super important. It really needs to happen, but it's like, yeah, it's easy to do those things, but do you actually care about those people?
Right.
And I think a lot of people do, but I think there's a good portion who do it because that's what they think they're supposed to do.
Yeah.
And yeah. And so there was a lot to unpack.
No,
there,
I definitely, yeah.
Yeah,
I
and so
feel
like,
that.
and this might be my frustration with evangelical, not what I meant to say there. Apologies. With evangelism, see, I told you it's confusing. Is that like a lot of times you can evangelize and not care about that person.
Yeah.
And like that is you can serve people and not care about them. So like that's my frustration and kind of my fear, and where I think the change needs to happen is that you can't be some rando person and actually serve and actually love and actually evangelize, right?
Yeah.
You can do it to a certain extent, but not to a depth that actually matters.
Right.
Yeah.
If I may,
No,
I think you hit something, like the non-caring part, right? I think one of the most frustrating things for me in my life is when people talk about like, oh, we went out and we shared the gospel with like X amount of people and X amount of people came to Christ, right? I understand that as something to be celebrated. I understand that as humans, we like the tangible, we like numbers. But at the core of it, like, there's always that nagging question that hits me, which is just like, okay, you shared it. Now, of those people that are now say that they believe, where's the follow-up, right?
Has their life changed?
Has their life truly changed? Are you just doing it for the sake of a number? Are you just doing it so you feel good and accomplished for following your own belief? And maybe that's on me for like being so like I don't know, like just like questioning everything, but like it unsettles me, right? And I get scared because I don't want to be like that. I don't want my life to just be like, oh, it's a numbers game where I'm just trying to accomplish like X and Y just to say that, oh, look at me and my Christian resume, like I'm doing great. So yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like a lot of what you're saying is true. I think a lot of it's rooted in this fear of like being associated with the other.
Yeah. Yeah.
So-
100%. I agree.
And it just came to me now of like, Jesus had no problem like sitting with sinners who he broke the social boundaries and not being afraid of that because his faith and relationship with God were so strong. Like, he was so certain that what he was doing was for God. That, like, he didn't care if he was going to be perceived the wrong way, of, like sitting with a prostitute or whatever, And I feel like that's a lot of what you're saying is rooted in that of like, I'll yell at those people. I'll talk to those people about Jesus, but like I don't want to be associated.
Right.
Like, because
Yeah.
then I might look bad. So
Right.
I don't know. That maybe I'm just speculating, but
No, I mean, I think some of that too is that that's a life we live. It's like we all have a wide, diverse group of friends, both individually and collectively, with all walks of faith. I mean, some of my closest friends over the years never step. I mean, one good friend of mine for a long time said, like, if I ever step in a church, I'm going to catch on fire. So I can't do that. And so I think in personal experience, we, like, that's just our lives. And so, no, I agree with you. I think it is fear of the other, right? And I think I thought you were saying that I was afraid of being associated with that person.
That wasn't accusing you.
Which, there's some validity there. I'm afraid of that.
Oh,
but
sorry.
I was like, anyways. But yeah, and so, like, no, I agree. I mean, I think that, and the exact same thing as you're saying is that it's really easy to evangelize from a distance. I really am sticking with this phrase. It's easy to evangelize from a distance. It's really hard to actually be in the trenches and care about people. Yeah, and I mean, I think that's my frustration.
Yeah. So I guess, like, to answer your question, that it doesn't need to change. It's like yes and no.
Yeah.
Nice.
Which is great. That's always the conclusion we come to here, I think. Like, because like I said, I think like at a certain point you can't get around the fact that people need to hear
Right.
what the Bible says. But like I think what needs to change is the way that we build these relationships without an ulterior motive. So it's not like you're a project I'm working on.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, you mentioned coworker. I was thinking of the restaurant job that I just quit. And I would go home thinking like, man, I probably wasn't doing a good job as a witness there. I'd I had a bad day. I was cranky or said something or did something. But like the people there see me like you were talking about. They're like, he's that Jesus guy. You know, like it's so radically different that like just living it out in a lot of ways like softens people.
Yeah.
Like, oh, maybe Christians aren't all psychos yelling on the street, you know? And I think a lot of the times, like the language we use, we take from like the New Testament and Paul. And a lot of what Paul was writing was for the church.
Yeah.
Like we're supposed to be holding the church accountable and making sure, I mean, nobody should be sinning, but like a lot of what he's writing about is keeping the church out of sin and like making sure Christians are not letting that stuff fly and like, you know, relapsing and things like that into Fortnite or otherwise.
Hey,
no, I'm just kidding.
I got that itch.
But like, I think we take a lot of that language and apply it to people who like don't even have a category of what sin might be. Or like, there are people like you try to tell them like you're not submitting to the authority of God, and like people aren't even convinced that there is a higher authority a lot of the time. And if there is, they're not convinced that it applies to them.
Right.
You know, so I think a lot of the language we're using is just not helpful to, and like, okay, yeah, if there's like a sex scandal going on in your church, like absolutely, you got to address that.
Right.
But like if some guy on the street, well, that's a weird example on the street.
Yeah, you chose a weird example.
If your friend who's not a Christian is having a sex scandal, like you should address it, but like you can't, like they don't share the same worldview as
Right.
you. They don't know the God who is saying that's not okay, you know, and like that's where the forgiveness and love, and I don't know, I'm babbling at this point, but like, yeah, I think it's just like we're trying to hold people to a worldview that they're completely unfamiliar with, and that's not helping anybody.
I think it isolates people in a lot of ways.
Right.
Yeah. No, and the point you made at the beginning is that, like, I will briefly touch on this, is that Paul wrote the letters to the church, not to the non-believers at the time, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Jesus just didn't say go yell at people for what they did.
Yeah. Like you said, Chris, like yes and no seems to be our answers for everything. But I do think, again, I appreciate you guys a lot. I feel like this is a conversation I'm going to have for a very long time. But the letters is a very good point, though. Like,
Yeah.
the romanticizing the early church, I think, is a very dangerous concept. One, for those who are still doing the same type of evangelism. Two, for those who are trying to stray away from it. So, yeah, hopefully this helped you. But I think it definitely helped me. So, gentlemen, it's a pleasure like always.
Welcome to Three Losers in a Church podcast. Make sure to check out our other episodes and then scroll down below. There's links to our social medias as well as everything else down there, including our show notes for this episode. Make sure to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, guys.